superpower, right? And I think thinking of it that way is pretty real. So you can talk to and hear anyone in the world. That's a superpower. And the third is like we have just like massive amounts of computational power. Like there's in your laptops in the room, as I know you're all very well aware, like more computational power than there was in the entire world probably in 1990, right? Which is again shocking. And that's basically like super intelligence, right? So we live in this time where, from a product perspective, one way to think about what's going on is that we all of a sudden have all these brand new superpowers, right? That technology has given us. You know, if you go back, there's an earlier generation where this was true too. Think about like a few generations ago before that. Like when people first had access to airplanes. Now, not everyone had access to them. It wasn't anywhere nearly as widespread as it is today, but that kind of was this like super speed superpower, right? Or combustion, when you had like internal combustion and you could build locomotion for the first time in trains, like all of a sudden you had like super strength, right? So one way to think about kind of the history of technology in general is that you can almost think about it as a succession of experiences where we're getting these new powers to kind of move forward in terms of what we want to do. One interesting point on this is, you know, you can talk about, if you think about comic books, I'm actually curious, do you guys like comic books? You read superhero comic books? All right, no one will admit it. I like comic books. But, you know, there's this interesting thing where some superheroes are born as superheroes, right? And some superheroes like discover their powers over time, right? They're not, there's kind of like the myth of how they come together. Uh-oh. Now we're looking at slides.
Went backwards a little.
Yeah, no. What happened?
Remember.
Okay, we're going to start over now. So we have this kind of, you know, there's some superheroes that are born superheroes, some people that grow into them. And the interesting thing about that is in that kind of way, you know, you look at kind of like kids and technology. This is another really interesting thing, is like technology means different things based on how old you are, right? So for this, you know, for little kids who, I don't know if you've ever seen kids play with iPads, but it's unbelievable, right? Like they jump right into them, they understand them instantly. They're almost like the superheroes who were born that way, right? And then there's people who are my age, I'm a little bit older, you know, people like that, where it's like you kind of like grow into your superpowers over time. Like these are evolving with us all the time. And I kind of always think that is like, you know, the story of like the X-Men, right? Where like Xavier has to like train them as they discover their superpowers over time. The reason I point this out is only like we live in this time again of new powers, but the way that people interact with those powers and understand them and are able to, you know, experience products around them is really different based on how they relate to them or where they kind of, how old they are even, in fact. Yeah, I'll just do it, it's fine. So, you know, it's just basically that we're kind of going through these different stages. So here's the thing. These powers change everything, right, about how we interact with the world and like what we can do and the capabilities we have. But my assertion is they don't actually change us, right? We are the same as we've always been. Humans evolve extremely slowly, right? Our interests are the same, our needs are the same, how we relate to the world is largely the same. We're just doing it with a whole new set of tools that didn't exist and is changing so unbelievably rapidly before our very eyes. And I'll drop the superhero thing in 1 second, but I will just point out that this is kind of true of like a Batman or a Superman also, right? So, you know, Batman, like the creation myth of Batman, right, who's a superhero that doesn't have any superpowers really, but is, you know, his parents are killed and like that like defines the rest of his life. Like he is the same character throughout. Superman, again, like is born this like farm boy, right? And he's always seeking out his past. He's seeking out kind of his history, but he stays the same. And it's actually one of the interesting things of the mythology of superheroes is usually the superheroes really are always the same, right? They face new challenges, but they as people are always the same. And it's usually the supervillains, right, that have something happen in their lives and really change their perspective or move forward. The reason I pointed out that I draw it together is I really think that when you kind of think about people versus kind of technology, we want the same things we've always wanted, right? We have the same motivations we've always had. And it's really, really important to separate out the new tools that we have all the time, right, from effectively the fundamental realities of kind of how we want to relate to the world and each other and what we care about. So a lot of times when I think about like the history of technology, and this goes back to kind of how you know the past, is imagine kind of a graph, right? And on one axis you have how fast can you move things around the world, and the other axis you have time, right? So down here at this point, this is like the beginning of time. Like we're living in caves, like nothing that interesting going on. It's all extreme local. There's no technology. That kind of line can kind of stay. There's basically been two major technological revolutions in history, right? And sweeps of kind of S-curves of technology. The first is like effectively our ability to move atoms around really efficiently, right? So physical objects. So you think about the history of that technology chain, it's things like the wheel, right? Pretty big deal, right? Combustion, trains, planes, automobiles, steam, triangular cells. You can plot it all out. And what you basically say is that it used to be that it was super hard to physically move anywhere. So what does that mean? It means everyone lived in small villages. You kind of interacted with the zone. Everything you'd ever know or interact with or consume or use was from a local space. But as effectively the speed of moving things around, or you could also think about the cost of moving things around, dropped really, really fast, all of a sudden, like our horizons expanded further and further, and all of a sudden we could trade with each other all over the world, and get resources from all over the world, and interact with everything around, not just our local space, but everywhere. And so there's this big chain of kind of moving things around. There's a second thread of kind of communication, of history, effectively, which isn't moving atoms, it's moving bits, right? And this is the interesting one, because in my mind, for a very long time, up until, I would argue, even today, right, even the world we were born into, in a lot of ways, it was much easier to get goods from all over the world than it was to get information from all over the world, right? So you might be really interested, you think about like your global supply chain or where you might get a beer from or drink a Heineken or whatever. It's actually a lot easier, right, in a lot of ways to move a product, right, than it was to necessarily move the information about the product or move the context of it or be able to communicate back to Germany if that's where you're drinking a beer from or whatever it might be. So we're in this interesting zone right now where we are driving as technologists, we're a big part of what I almost talk about as information catching back up with goods and services, right? So down here, you basically only consume things locally. You only know the people that are right around you. You know them really well. You know them your whole life, but there's such a small range of things you interact with. We've already experienced like a lot of globalization, what it means for goods to move all over the world. We're now experiencing what it means for information to catch back up, right? And actually be able to move just as fast as goods and services. So basically, when I talk through how I think about this and a lot of the innovation that you see happening in the world right now around products and technology, I really start again with this thing, which is people are the same, they want the same things they've always wanted, and they wanted when they were in villages and the whole 9 yards. We went through this crazy period, effectively, where goods and services, but really, the physical objects in the world moved really, really fast, right? But actually information was super slow in a lot of ways. And what we are now experiencing is these new superpowers, right? Like these new, we literally are superheroes. And we're actually having, as information catches back up with goods and services, the world starts to look a lot like the last time, effectively, information, bits and atoms, or information and goods moved the same speed, which was when we all lived in a very small space, right? So let me take you through a few examples, and these are all very high level of how I think about this. So we talk about social networking, something that I assume you guys are familiar with in some form, that I spend a lot of time working on. Some fundamental truths. We enjoy friendships and relationships. That's not new, right? That has always been the case, right? That's actually, humans are so fundamentally social as creatures that actually if you do an fMRI scan of people when they sleep, and they just started doing this where you map what people are thinking about while they sleep by looking at doing an fMRI when they're awake, and then you do it again when they're asleep and see what they're thinking about. You know what humans dream about? They dream about interacting with other humans. Like, that's what we do, right? And so it's very critical about how we think about it. We want to feel loved, right? Like, people want the love and acknowledgement of the other people around them and the world around them. And people really, I think, at a fundamental level, have always wanted to express themselves to others as valuable and unique, right? This has always been true. The question is, how does that manifest itself in terms of products? So let's go back all the way to the beginning of time and imagine what it must have been like to be in a small village, right? You can think about a world where you probably had a very limited number of really deep relationships with people you could walk to, because you couldn't get in a car, you couldn't, go halfway around the world. That was the people you'd spend time with. And you basically you express to them, or your identity with them, when you think about it, was the sum of probably years and decades of interactions with them. They knew you so well because you were always interacting with them in physical space in the small zone. So the nice part was you knew people really well. The bad part was you probably only knew a few people, right? Now, let's make up a random year in the not too distant past, like 1980, right? Like, think about what a friendship was then, or how that would work. So all of a sudden, depending in the U.S., which is obviously it's a pretty mobile country, right? And I think a lot of different countries are kind of follow the same pattern. Probably not everywhere in the world, but people get really mobile, right? They can go really long distances. You might go to university in a different place you live, in a different place you grew up from, right? There's like a lot of hopping around in terms of how you move, which is all the benefit of all this transportation technology we had invented or had access to, right? But it actually made it super hard to maintain long-term relationships, right? So, I asked my parents, for instance. My parents really aren't that close to their university friends. It's not that they don't like them. It's just their lives went in different directions, and it was super hard and it was super expensive to stay in touch in a lot of ways. And then here's another interesting thing is, because you kind of would all of a sudden live in a city, or you live around a lot of people you didn't know, you were moving around, you didn't have those same relationships, I would argue that a lot of self-expression came down to using things like brands, clothing, luxury items, what watch do you wear, what backpack do you have. These were kind of how people expressed themselves to each other, because it was really, really hard to know the people around you in that environment, if that makes sense. So think about the future, right? Again, think about what happens when information catches back up with transportation in a lot of ways. And, I think you might argue with social networking, it becomes a lot easier to maintain way more friendships in a meaningful way, right? I don't see my college roommates all the time, but I feel very close to them. And in fact, I actually had dinner with one of them in Sao Paulo. I hadn't seen in a very long time because he happened to be here, which is pretty cool. It's easier to make friends faster because you can learn so much about someone so quickly, right? By instead of having a 6-hour conversation of, who do you know in common, you can start making those matches really, really quickly. You can always be in contact, right, which is super interesting. And I think this is a really big difference. What I'm fascinated by is what happens when you go towards expression through communication, through Snapchat and Instagram, and how you express yourself in media versus what brands you wear or what clothes you buy or what bands you like, right? Which was a form, I think, of the kind of mass expression that worked really well when you didn't have access to forms of communication that you would have had in the past. Privacy, here's another really interesting one. I would argue that one way to think about the things that are true about privacy is if you asked an average person and really got them to tell you the truth, what they say is they would love to know everything about everyone else and hold whatever opinion they want of them, right? However, they want control over what everyone knows about them, right? That would probably be the way it generally works, right, at some level. And so if you think about history, again, strip all the technology out of the world and think what that would be like. In history, there's a strong argument, there's very little privacy in small villages, right? Everyone knows everyone else's business. That you live in kind of this open zone. There's a small number of people, but everyone knows it. And you could leave, right? So you could kind of, if you take the American, like a Western, get on your horse and ride into the sunset and find another town, right? Where no one would know who you were, right? But it was this, you'd lose your identity. So there was basically this interesting thing where that's kind of the way, in a lot of ways, the world worked for a very long time, I would argue. When you fast forward to the world we lived in not too long ago, that most of us were born into in a lot of ways, there's this interesting dynamic, which was that because of mass media and mass culture and the ability to move things around in a lot of ways, privacy was actually pretty inexpensive. Things are almost private by default. You probably didn't really know your neighbors that well in a big city. Maybe you did in some cases, but the default was probably not that, just because you no longer have those village dynamics, right? And publicity, let's pretend you wanted everyone in the world to hear you say something or had a viewpoint, was extremely difficult. How are you going to do that? You're going to buy newspaper ads? Are you going to shout on street corners? It was almost impossible to do, right? And what's interesting when you think about the future again, in terms of the return to the past, is I would argue that what's happening is actually things are inverting, right? And so all of a sudden, publicity is really inexpensive and easy, right? If you want to shout to the whole world, you can go to Twitter, you can go to Facebook, you can go to 15 other platforms and have a pretty broad stage to talk to everyone, which is mind-boggling. Just stepping back for a second that you can do that. That's an amazing power, right? But what's happening at the same time is that privacy is now this thing which, rather than being free, if you want it, you kind of have to invest in it, right? It's harder to be private than it is to be public. Not impossible, but you have to value it in order to achieve it, which I think is a lot the way thinking about history used to work. Let's talk about advertising. So advertising, if you take the broad view on it, right? It's not specifically about the way we think about it today, but the broad view is saying, look, universally, we get value from telling people about things that would help them, right? Like if there's a product in the world they might not know about, right? And you have it or you think you can help them, the ability to like get that message in front of them is like extremely valuable and powerful, and it's pretty much always existed. It might have been, hundreds of years ago, the guy who runs the local convenience store saying, hey, I got a new shipment, and knowing you because you're neighbors and saying I know you need a rake, I have a rake for you. Like that is advertising, right? And it's super valuable in a lot of ways. But on the flip side, we only want to like listen to certain people at certain times, right? Like we don't want open access to ourselves personally for anyone because, frankly, one of the side costs of modernity is, if you actually think you have a superpower, which is you can speak to everyone in the world. Well, the problem with the superpower to speak to everyone in the world is that imagine how that would work in real life. Like pretend you had to use your ears for that. If everyone could speak to everyone, you would hear nothing, right? And I think when you start contextualizing, that's kind of like the zone you can think about where we're getting into. So again, you look at it in history, the people you would talk to really know you, they understand what you need, they understand what you want, you'd have like a social contract with them in some form, and you'd listen to recommendations from people, like that's kind of how things work. Again, you went through this curve where it was really easy to move products around, but pretty hard to move information around, and what happens, you have all these like mass brands that attempt to market to everyone. Right? So if you take like a McDonald's, it's like why was McDonald's they're having struggles now, but why were they so successful for so long? Well, they had invented a product that was pretty much universal, that everyone liked, and then they told everyone about it, right? It's totally generic. In terms of Starbucks might be another example. It's like, is Starbucks the best coffee? No, right? But is Starbucks pretty good coffee that they can market to everyone and tell everyone about? Yes, right? And so there's kind of this interesting non-personal zone that evolves from that. And what happens now is, I think as advertisers can know you, and again, there's a lot of questions about how and in what context and how you want to tell them about yourself, but I really do believe that we're moving back towards a world, kind of like having the local convenience store guy, where everyone's interests are aligned. People want to tell you about things you're interested in, right? You want them to tell you about things you're interested in. You can create a marketplace around that in really powerful ways. So those are some examples. The big one I want to spend a little bit of time talking about in terms of this context and what it means to return to the past is the sharing economy. I hate the term the sharing economy. This is a terrible term. You might as well call it the rainbow economy. It doesn't mean anything. But what I think is kind of more obvious, you think about like on-demand consumption and production and things like that. And when you think about what this means, it's I love this image. I saw this once. The kind of concept is, historically you'd say, well, I have a problem, like I need to drill a hole, so I need to drill. But that's not really what you need. What you need is a hole, right? And so the idea of like the on-demand economy or the sharing economy, whatever you want to call it, the rainbow economy, is the idea that basically with better communication, you can move back into a world where you're very, very oriented around not necessarily owning things or not necessarily, having like building up all this infrastructure, but instead just being able to get access to what you want, when you want, how you want. And you might know, there's 1,000 companies that are doing versions of this, an Airbnb, a HomeJoy, Uber, 99 taxis, WeWork. There's 1,000 of these. But the basic model is make it so that you can hit a button and get what you want, right? This is having real economic impact. I saw this recently. This is Ford CEO who's talking about, which I think is very legitimate for them, how actually things like Uber or 99 taxis, these things, are going to have a real impact on the auto industry, right? Because all of a sudden you might need way fewer cars, which, by the way, might help with the traffic in Sao Paulo. But I think what it really comes down to is moving towards this world of on-demand services and rental services, and a world where I really believe that, and this is very much part of return to the past, is that it's only people who can't afford to rent things or don't have the social capital to borrow them that are going to own things, right? And that's kind of a crazy concept, right? But I think that in a lot of ways, ownership of things will end up becoming a burden more than an asset. So let me just step back for a second. When you think about the universal principles, like what do people really want? It's like they have needs, they have wants, they come up all the time. And it's not that you like want to own something; it's that you want to use something or have access to something, like whenever you need it, right? That might even be Amazon EC2 instances for what it's worth, right? As another example of how this stuff comes up. But like you want to do that, and then the reality is that owning things is like super expensive, right? It actually is really time consuming. If you own a server, you have to wash it. You have to, reboot your server, whatever it's going to be. Like, there's just like a cost associated with ownership and maintenance, which is baked into. I think these are like very universal concepts you can go back to. And what's happening is that our communication superpower increased basically coordination, so our ability to like build marketplaces and meet up and basically share things back and forth efficiently, and trust. Right? Meaning I actually trust a stranger to drive me around town or come to my home and help me with something or drill a hole in my wall, whatever it might be. And these are kind of the fundamental ingredients, I think, that actually you used to have in villages, right? So in a village, so much of the capital of a society or a group of people was tied up in them doing things, helping each other, right? And there was no explicit balance sheet, no one was paying in cash. It was more, I will help you with this and you will help me with that. Right? I will help you take your crops in, and you will help me build my barn, right? Or whatever it might be, right? And so I think, again, when you map this out, there's basically, in history, you know your neighbors, you trust your neighbors, you collaborate and share, and actually, like, you, in a lot of ways, have this collaborative consumption model, or this sharing model with your neighbors and friends in this really intimate way. The problem was, obviously, you only had so many neighbors. It wasn't super efficient necessarily all the time, but you did have this kind of concept of collaborative consumption. What happened is, again, in 1980, everything's traded in currency, right? It's no longer, you got away because all of a sudden, all these goods that people wanted to buy, if you want to buy a Heineken, from a German company, or whatever, you make it up, and you can't exactly say, well, I'll help you with your crops, right, or I'll help you, mow your lawn, right? They don't accept that as a form of payment, and so with a lot of these kind of countries, as trade spread out, it was harder and harder to share social capital in a lot of ways, and also coordination was really hard. Like, where do you know where to get goods and services? Like, how do you do these things? So you had like kind of a dollar or a currency mediated experience. In the future, I think we're going back to the past, right? Which basically means that you know and trust and can work with not just your neighbors, but your broader sense of the neighbors, which is people you really can understand, that are in the city or even the region you're in. And I will throw out a second one, which is a kind of like push on, which I think, and I will fly this. I can't remember the one we had, a disclaimer in the last presentation. I'll put a disclaimer. This is a little bit crazy, but I'll say it anyway, which is the question becomes in the future. In the past, you pay in social currency effectively. So you would never trade cash with your neighbor. They might come over to your house for dinner, you remember that, then you go over to their house. There was kind of a loose accounting system that worked over a long period of time. The question is, how are you going to pay in the future, right, for a lot of these things? And that gets into this question of economics and capital. So here's my crazy thought of the afternoon that I'll leave you with, and then I'm happy to talk more, or we can do Q&A or whatever. But so there's kind of two really crazy things that fall out of a world that moves back towards the old model of how we interact with each other for goods and services and commerce. The first to recognize is this, historically people say, well, technology is always good for GDP. It's always good for the production of a country. It always makes it go up. So even if you might displace some jobs or change an economy, it's always net positive. But there's a really big difference between consumption efficiency and production efficiency. And almost all the technology we've experienced to date make us more efficient at producing things, not necessarily more efficient at using things, right? And so there's a really interesting question about what happens to things like production or GDP at the macro level when we start getting dramatically more efficient at consuming things than we are at getting more efficient at producing things. And the second thing, which I think is important to keep in mind, is we're talking a lot about how cash is a communication tool. You can almost think about cash or money as a hack, right? Which is, you used to know the people you traded with, so it's easy to trade with them, right? You could trust each other, you could trade lots of different types of goods and services. That doesn't work in a world where you don't know your counterpart, right? It just doesn't. There's actually a very famous and interesting story from the US where the US dollar basically became a currency that people cared about at a national level almost exactly when the railroad system was built. Right? And you ask, well, why is that? Well, it's because before the railroads, people just traded locally. So they use banknotes, they use all sorts of different intermediate currencies to trade with each other and just like trust effectively. The second you had a national economy, people in California had no idea which banks to trust in New York, right? Which is solvent, which isn't, what is this piece of paper you're giving me? I don't know, right? And so actually, literally, in a lot of ways, you can think about currency as a hack, which helps us buy and sell and interact with each other when we don't know each other, right? So again, what happens when all of a sudden we can know each other again? I think you can think of, again, like history, social currency, a little bit of financial currency. I actually think that we're going to go back to a world where the majority of our transactions over time are in social denominated currencies rather than financial currency. This is crazy, by the way, but just to like put a good point on it. But I actually think that in the future, and we are already experiencing this, money is becoming less important. That doesn't mean it's going away. That doesn't mean like I'm not crazy about this, but I do think that on the margin, that is the direction we're heading. And I think it kind of looks something like this, which is, again, you're in a village. You're down here, and you can think about this bottom line is financial capital, or like dollar-denominated capital. This top line is what I almost consider like total trade, right? So you trade with your friends in all sorts of ways that aren't denominated in dollars. And you can think about a world where initially the world was pretty driven by actually social capital, not financial capital. There wasn't that much financial capital. With the rise of transportation technologies, the relevance of financial currency dramatically increased, right? And I actually think if you think about it, there was a big switch in society away from producing things that were basically denominated in social currency versus financial currency. A good example of this, women entering the workforce all over the world, right? Now, women entering the workforce has been a huge driver of growth because half the population, this is obviously exaggerating, but almost half the population that wasn't doing things in the quote-unquote economy, all of a sudden we're in the quote-unquote economy. But here's the thing. There's something wrong with that math, right? Because it wasn't like women weren't doing anything before, right? They were in traditional settings taking care of the home and the family and the community. And they were building all sorts of capital. They just weren't denominated in dollars, right? And so I actually think what's happening is as effectively communication technology, the superpowers of our time, revalue in a lot of ways social capital. It makes it useful again because all of a sudden you can actually use it and trade it and know about it on a broader scale. There's an argument that we're actually already in a lot of ways, in small ways, seeing the reversal of that move, right? And if you look at kind of younger generations and labor force participation and how you choose to spend your incremental time or dollar, it doesn't mean that money is important. It's obviously critical, right? You need enough to live and buy things like housing and food and things like that. But when you think about the broader picture, I think it's very, very possible that our generation of technology, these superpowers, are going to dramatically increase the concept of how much we interact with each other and trade with each other and how vibrant a culture and economy you have, but might not actually drive up the traditional measures of a cash economy the same way, right? Which I think is going to create all sorts of interesting problems and challenges and things like that. So I'll bring it back and then take any questions there, but I think the way I kind of think about a lot of products at this point, and this is obviously very broad-based, but a lot of the things that you can work on with technology as practitioners, building actual things people use, is I like to think that actually the 20th century was kind of an anomaly. We were born into a historical anomaly of how we interact with each other and how the world communicated and traded. And in a lot of ways, I think the 21st century, what we are all building in various ways, and we're working on as kind of a grand project of the generation, is a lot of ways a return to the way the world used to work, just at much better scale and much more efficiently and in much more interesting ways. So I think what I'll leave on, and questions are fine, is our generation really isn't a generation, I think, of fundamental technology, right? The fundamental superpowers are there, right? They've been built. These things were invented by, a few generations ago, a lot of really brilliant people. But what that means is that a lot of what product is in our day and age, and technology is in our day, is taking these fundamental concepts, building them out, making them functional, and actually getting them in the hands of all the people in the world, right? letting them actually experience the benefits of technologies. And for me, that's why the things that I really gravitate towards, I think are most interesting, although there's a lot that's interesting going on, are communication tools, right? Because there's so much to be done there to actually make this stuff usable, right, and useful. Marketplaces, right? Rails is a good example of a marketplace, for instance, right? Where actually you're helping people use information in new ways to come together and find whether it's the right place to live or the right job or anything they might want, where they're not just stuck in like the information vacuum they'd normally be stuck in. And I think these are the types of things that are the great works of our generation. So I'm a big fan of things like Oculus. There's a lot of cool stuff on the horizon, but this is the stuff that I think is really going to change the world. And really matters in terms of seeing, I think, what will be some of the biggest shifts in cultural and societal norms and expectations probably over the last several hundred years. So hopefully that's interesting, but that's kind of what I'm going to say. Questions, comments? Yeah.
Yeah, you say that in the future, companies will know much more about us. So what do you think about this idea that we are become products instead of consumers? Like to companies, like they're going to use our data and provide us like better whatever they're providing. So we're becoming products.
Yeah, I mean,
what do you think about it?
I think. I don't know is the answer, is the honest answer. But here's the way I kind of think about it, is I think people sometimes feel like there's this, with some companies or just companies in general, that there's like a people versus companies dynamic that goes on. But I think the thing that I always come back to, and I'm an optimist about these things, is companies exist to serve people, right? And they generally play by the same rules as people. So I glanced on this when we were talking about privacy a little bit, but here's the really interesting problem, is I'm a person, and you guys are all people. I've been up here expressing myself for a while, and I have that's a lot of data about me. You guys now all have a lot of data.